So now we turn to part two of our look at Thomas Hobbes, his theory of rights, the state of nature, and how to get out of that state. So within the state of nature, according to Hobbes, we do have rights. As we'll see, these are rather different from the rights that John Locke believed that we had in the state of nature. But let's see what Hobbes has to say about this. So what then is the foundation of these natural rights? Because, basic question is, if you believe in natural rights, the question is, what is their basis? Where do they come from? And of course, there's also the question of, what are they? So here's how Hobbes reasons through this. So he claims, on his view of human psychology, essentially it's a desire-aversion psychology, in that people desire what is they see as good for them, and they avoid what they regard as evil. Hobbes thinks that everyone regards death as the main natural evil. And he asserts that it doesn't go against reason to use all your efforts to defend your body. And for Hobbes, he's a metaphysical materialist, so you are your body. And he claims that what is not contrary to right reason, all account to be done justly and with right. And usually when philosophers say everyone agrees with them, that's pretty much never the case. So he essentially thinks that it's just a matter of reason that all this makes sense. So what for him is a right, the basic right? Well, he claims it's this. A right is a liberty, and the one he's looking at is the liberty that every person has to use their natural faculties according to right reason. And so, of course, this would require defining what is liberty, what are the natural faculties, and what is right reason. And typically philosophers think right reason is what they think. And for him, the foundation of natural right, is this, that every person, as much in him lies endeavors to protect his life and members. So essentially, put in plainer terms, his view is that the first foundation of natural right is people try to stay alive. So that's the foundation. So how do we get other rights out of this, and what might those rights be? Well, in addition to this foundation of natural right, which essentially seems to be that people, try to stay alive, he thinks that we have another right, which is the right to the means to keep ourselves alive. What's his reasoning? Well, he holds that it's vain, it's pointless to have a right if you don't have the means to achieve the end of that right. That, if you can't use the right, then there's no point to it. And he thinks that everyone has a right of self-preservation, and from this he infers, given the previous reasoning there, that if we have the right of self-preservation, we must have the right to use all means and all actions to engage that right, to engage in self-preservation. And in terms of who decides what means and actions are necessary, Hobbes, of course, says that it's the individual. So it's up to the person to decide what they should use to preserve themselves. So this ends up being, for Hobbes, the right to all things. And he thinks this is a right given by nature to everyone. And the right is this. He asserts that in the state of nature, before we have any covenants, agreements, law, etc., that it's lawful for each person to do what he would do against whom he thought fit. Basically, to do whatever he wants and to possess, use, and enjoy all he would or get. So essentially, the right to all, exactly what it sounds like. A person has a right to literally everything, and the right to do whatever he wants to whoever he wants. And this applies, to everybody. Everybody has this right to all things. So what seems good to people? Well, as Hobbes sees it, that either it does actually contribute to one's preservation, or the person at least thinks that it does. And who decides? Well, his view is the person. So all it takes is essentially, all you got to do is think that this would contribute to my survival, so therefore I have a right to it, and it's good. In the state of nature, therefore, the result of all this is that everything is yours, but of course this applies to everyone else, and to do anything is lawful. Of course, this applies to everyone else. So literally, the state of nature, the rule is everything belongs to, like in my case, me, and I can do anything, and this is lawful. This, of course, applies to everyone. And so in the state of nature, for Hobbes, he says the measure of right is profit, whatever is advantageous. And again, he thinks this applies to everyone. Everyone has the right to all things. And he might begin to suspect why this could be a potential problem. So, since nature has given everyone a right to everything, it's lawful for us to do whatever we want because we want to do it. And again, profit is a measure of right in this context. So why does this lead to problems? Well, you probably suspect why it does, because for Hobbes, everyone has a right to everything, and everyone can do whatever they want. And the natural result of this, according to Hobbes, is conflict. So here is how it takes place. So in effect, even though each of us in this state of nature would have a right to all things, to do all things, this would effectively be no right at all. It would be, although at first it may sound pretty cool, I've got a right to everything, I can do whatever I want, then we quickly realize it's not cool, because the effect is the same essentially as if there was no right at all. How so? Well, of everything in the state of nature, I could say this is mine, but of course you could say the same thing with equal correctness. It's yours too. And I could say I want to do this, and you could say you want to do the same thing. So effectively, there would be no property, because everything belongs to me, but everything also belongs to you and to everyone else. Not like in a nice shared way where we're all sharing stuff, but in the sense that no one has a right, everyone has a right to everything. So in effect, no one has any special right to it. And of course, since Hobbes thinks we're equal in power, because we can all kill each other, we all have the right to everything. People would claim things, and everyone would have the right to do so, to claim anything they want. And being equal in capacity to kill, this is where we get what he calls the war of all against all. And it's caused for Hobbes that we have a tendency, as he claimed earlier, to be willing to hurt each other, either to defend oneself against others, or to invade others and take from them, and they resist. So he thinks part of it is that that competition. Also, as we saw earlier, Hobbes thinks that people have very high opinions of themselves, very full of pride and arrogance. That causes trouble. And of course, we have a right to all things, so everybody thinks everything is theirs, and they're right. And so one goes to take it, and of course the other person believes correctly it's theirs, but the other person believes correctly it's theirs, so conflict. And he thinks this results in jealousies and suspicions. So the natural state of humanity, according to Hobbes, before society, would be a war of all against all. Essentially, to use a modern metaphor for it, essentially it'd be like battle royale games, if they're still a thing, player versus player, no team combat. In Halo, it used to be called like Slayer mode, where everybody would try to kill everybody. Those types of, in those video games, everyone's against everybody, and everything belongs to everybody, because anything you can grab is yours as long as you can keep it. But as soon as someone else kills you, it's theirs. So a good modern comparison would be, basically a video game battle royale, deathmatch with no teams, everybody fighting everybody. Now, in the case of a video game, that can be fun because you're not actually getting hurt, and of course you get to respawn, so death is not permanent typically. But in the case of war of all against all in nature, not so good. Why not so good? Well, the not goodness in a way is pretty evident because it would tend to result in the death of individuals, and it's also not good for preserving humanity in general because if everybody's fighting everybody, there's lots of death. Hobbes also sees it as perpetual because since everyone's equal and there's no like teams, then there can be no victory because there's no one person or one side that can achieve an advantage. It's everybody's equal, and pushed to the kind of the extreme, the end result would be there'd be like one final person left after, I guess, killing everybody. So he describes it as in the following quotable quote, which is that life was fierce, short, poor, nasty, and deprived of pleasure and beauty, which peace and society can bring. So he sees the state of nature as awful, but he thinks that people would understand that society would be better than this. So there are thinkers who do like the state of nature, and of course their view of it is a much nicer state of nature than Hobbes's view. But he thinks that if people say the state of humans before a civil society was like best, and we should have kept that, Hobbes claims that they contradict themselves. Again, because on Hobbes' conception, it's terrible. Obviously, if you have a much nicer conception of the state of nature, then it wouldn't be as bad as Hobbes says, obviously. So he claims that in terms of his reasoning for this, he thinks that everyone naturally desires, as a matter of natural necessity, that is to say, again, not like that it's a necessity like food and shelter, but in the sense of it must be, like triangles must have, it's a necessity that triangles have three sides because they must. So by natural necessity, it must be because of what is natural, that every person wants what is good for them. And the war of all against all, according to Hobbes, is not good because you're in constant danger and then, death and stuff. And again, Hobbes's point is not to say, oh, this is all terrible, we're all doomed, but to get us out of that situation. So how does one get out of this state of nature? Well, what he kind of proposes is, in going from, say, battle royale of everybody against everybody with no teams to a team video game where we might be able to get, allies. And so if there must be war, perhaps, not all against all, but, team against team with assistance. So how do we get allies? Well, Hobbes thinks there are two possibilities. One is constraint. The other is consent. Constraint is basically force. When someone conquers somebody else, it makes the conqueror serve them by fear of, death or imprisonment. Consent, of course, is with agreement, with both parties, consenting to cooperate. Now, Hobbes has a, moral view of conquering that essentially says might make right. He says a conqueror may, by right, compel the conquered, or the strongest the weaker. So someone who's healthy may compel someone who is sick, or the older may compel a child. So pretty harsh view of relations between like healthy people and sick people and older people and children. So we have this right, according to him, of protecting ourselves, and this comes from the danger we face, and our danger arises from our equality and our will. So he thinks it's quite reasonable, and on the grounds of keeping yourself alive, if you have an advantage to secure yourself, and he seems to be talking about kids, which sounds kind of horrible, now than when they are grown and strong. And so he says nothing is more absurd than discharging one you have in your power, making him both an enemy and a strong one. So in terms of justifying, might makes right, he asserts exactly that a sure and irresistible power confers the right of dominion and ruling over those who cannot resist. So the first option is conquering. Essentially, if one has superior power and one can force someone to go along, to obey, then he thinks that is right. It's simply on the basis of the superior power. Now, you might think, doesn't this seem to go against Hobbes's view that everyone's equal? Well, what he seems to be presenting is cases where someone happens to have an advantage in a particular circumstance, such as, someone is, sick or injured. So someone who's in that situation, healthy or not injured, would have the advantage. And he seems, again, kind of horrifically to put children in that, position because they are weaker. So what about the consent part? And that's what he focuses more on. So he thinks that the law of nature also gives a dictate in terms of achieving, this state of not war. So he claims that in the state of nature, we really can't expect lasting preservation. Really, death is going to arrive, injury and death, because according to Hobbes, we're equal in power, and hence, even if we do get some advantage and are able to conquer somebody, the equality, will run into that problem again, and eventually, of course, get killed. So he thinks that reason tells us, and he thinks this is also a law of nature, that we should seek peace when it can be attained and when not, inquire out for the auxiliaries of war. So essentially, seek peace, and if you can't get peace, prepare for war, is essentially, or be ready for war. So he's put us into this horrible hypothetical situation, a state of a war of all against all, which is, terrible. In some cases, we can conquer others through our power and make them serve us. But what he's looking for is something more lasting, something involving consent. So how does that get brought about? Well, his answer is in the form of the sovereign. And here is how the sovereign works. So in Hobbes's famous work, The Leviathan, he discusses how this comes about. And pictured here is the cover of the Leviathan. And looking at it, you can see, like a large human figure with a sword and a, scepter thing behind a hill looming over a city. And it looks like he's got kind of like a bad skin condition or wearing like some weird clothing. Looks kind of like the Marvel superhero The Thing. But if you look closer at it, the giant king there, this body is made up of people. Now, Hobbes is not like envisioning some sort of weird, monster thing. Oh, I guess in a way he kind of is. But he sees the sovereign is made up of everyone, composed of all the individuals. So here's how, according to Hobbes, we get out of the state of nature. So we're in the state of nature, everyone's equal, it's a competition of everybody against everybody. There is a possibility, as he sees it, of conquering people and forcing them to be on your team. But what he's looking for is a more secure method of getting consent. And how is this going to work? Well, for Hobbes, as we saw, he looks at various natural laws. But for him, these laws are not part of a objective moral order in sort of like Plato or Aristotle's view, where it's like there's like a metaphysical nature of, goodness and virtue, etc. Nor obviously in the kind of medieval view or an objective moral order, typically based on God. Although Hobbes does talk about God, he doesn't take, as we'll see when we go through his solution, he doesn't seem to think that these are laid out by God. So the laws that he talks about are general rules that are part of the physical world. And the way you discover them is you understand the nature of this physical world, because again, Hobbes is a materialist, so it's just physical, there's no soul. He does talk a bit about God, that if God exists, you have to be a material being, and he essentially sort of, says this is something that's better left to, say, religion. So the laws, as we've seen, the first law is survival, which is stay alive. The second, what follows from this, according to him, is that we get a right to all things, which are the means to fulfill that first law of survival. And he says that what we should do is seek peace, but be prepared to preserve our life by any means necessary. So we then find a means, according to Hobbes, to get this to occur, to keep peace. And the way we do this, he claims, is we give up our right to all things, provided everyone else does. So how do we do this? Well, we do this out of selfishness. So it's not that we're not giving it up because we're like people, etc. We're doing it out of pure selfishness. But that, of course, creates a problem, because if we're totally selfish and we say, okay, I give my right to all things, what's to prevent me from, taking stuff when I think I can get away from it, or get away with it, to break, this agreement? So Hobbes believes that people are egoists, that we look out for ourselves, first, and we're primarily concerned with our own well-being as we see it. And so we have to be compelled by a coercive power to stick to our agreements. And the way we do this, according to Hobbes, is where we create a sovereign. This could be one person, could be an assembly, and we essentially, so perhaps metaphorically, we imbue into one person or one assembly. And Hobbes he doesn't say it has to be like a king or a parliament or a congress, but you do have to have a sovereign, and we imbue that sovereign with our will, so to speak. And he calls this sovereign the Great Leviathan, hence the title of the work, Leviathan, or sometimes calls it an artificial man, or that mortal god. And so this, for him and others, is a social contract theory. We agree with each other, and we create, according to him, this sovereign. So what is this social contract? Now, it's an important concept in political philosophy and ethics, because it's essentially the view, and of course the particular form varies from thinker to thinker, that the foundation of government is, a contract. We come to an agreement and we form a contract that establishes, the foundation. Essentially it is, we consent. We agree to a political system. Now, you may be thinking, hey, I don't remember signing a contract, with the United States or with other people to have this government. If you're born here, you're just born into citizenship. A person who becomes a naturalized citizen, they do enter into like a formal agreement, so they would do that. But if you're just born American, you were just born that way, and you probably don't recall like doing this. So Hobbes doesn't think that we explicitly have to engage in a contract, although this could be done. The idea essentially, and Locke addresses this explicitly, that we give essentially a tacit consent, that by being born here and agreeing to go along with it, you agree to the contract. And again, Hobbes doesn't think that perhaps that this is how it really happened, that we could go and find like the original contract in some dusty pyramid or vault somewhere. But he thinks this is how it would work conceptually. So he says, it's as if each person signed this agreement. So here would be the agreement. I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or assembly of men on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in a like manner. So essentially what we're doing is we collectively give up our right, our right to all things, our right of self-governing to a person or persons. And if everyone does this, then we have this contract. Now the contract is between us as individuals, because the state, we've agreed with each other to create this office, the king, parliament, congress, whatever we've got. And it's agreement among us, but not between us and the state. So once we agree to create a sovereign, we give up initially all rights, except one, which is the right of self-preservation. Roughly put, if the government tries to kill us, we have the right to try to kill them right back. Now, he doesn't explicitly say that this sovereign has to be like a king, or has to be a parliament, or a three-branch government. He does express preference for a single ruler, but his theory would allow for any type of sovereign to become, the actual sovereign. He does not explicitly present a division of power like we have in the United States, with the president, the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches. And he probably took this view because during the English Civil War, it arose in part because of a division of power between the king, the lords, and the House of Commons. And so the division of power led to chaos. But this is a preference he expresses, but he doesn't say that his theory requires that you have a single ruler. Now, given how this works, that we're basically terrible, and we form this agreement out of selfishness, wouldn't the sovereign be also pretty terrible? And Hobbes considers this and considers that acceptable, because he thinks that the worst tyrant would be better than no government or weak government, which is an interesting moral question in political philosophy about whether that's true. Now, his sovereign initially has absolute power. So what do the citizens, get if the sovereign has this absolute power? What kind of rights do they have? Because according to Hobbes, once you engage in this contract, you give up every right except self-preservation. So the rights you do get, you could get some, and these would be your artificial rights. So you retain the natural right of self-preservation, and whatever rights you get would be those granted by the sovereign. This could, of course, be a lot of rights. Could be, a sovereign, a governmental system, which gives people a whole bunch of artificial rights. Or it could be incredibly restrictive. Hobbes doesn't really go into detail about exactly what all the rights that one should or should not have. An interesting feature of his view is that the sovereign cannot act unjustly, because most philosophers characterize Hobbes as a legal positivist or a legalist, because he seems to have the view that law and justice stem from governmental authority, and so what the state defines as legal is right, quotation marks around that, and what they define as illegal is wrong, with quotation marks. So the state defines, good, right, and wrong. Why? Well, his reasoning is, if people were permitted to decide which laws were just and unjust, then the result would be chaos. And his whole deal is avoiding that chaos. Now, in his own time, this often happens to philosophers, not well received, because the royalists, the people backing the king, weren't too fond of his rejection of the divine right of kings. And they tended to prefer a more substantial and dignified foundation to government than a ruler, a sovereign, created out of fear and desperation. People who were more democratically inclined had criticisms about that absolute power that the sovereign had. And of course, people who were concerned about ethics, objective ethics, would raise issue with his view that, whatever the state says is legal is therefore right, whatever the state says is illegal is therefore wrong. Now, Hobbes, of course, was hugely influential with this political view, and when pretty much any time you might happen to, if you ever read an article by a political writer, professional writer, talking about some conflict in a state that's in a civil war, and they'll often bring up they'll practically can't resist quoting Hobbes, probably because they took a poli-sci or philosophy class, and about talking about the state of nature. And one could look at it in terms of Hobbes presents basically a might-based view of political legitimacy. Whatever sovereign can hold power and maintain, therefore, the consent of the governed through their power, they're the rightful government. It avoids, all kinds of metaphysical stuff about, objective morality, etc., and sort of presents it in a very blunt and brutal fashion. So that's our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, and his social contract. Next, we'll turn to a kinder, gentler review from our good dead friend, John Locke. But stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.